It's been a long day. Good afternoon to the chairman and to the members. Thank y'all so much for having me. I am Dr. Stephanie Boyce. I am a professor and an entrepreneur in Dallas, Texas, and I'm a fellow in the Texas Education Policy Institute. Today I'm testifying on Senate Bill 2202. I am a Texas girl, born and bred. For years, I've seen monocultural perspectives of history taught in classrooms and books. Now, as educators start to challenge those views, we see bills like this one pop up to promote all viewpoints, when that has never been the case here. When met with an opportunity to stand up and create legislation that promotes progress in Texas, we are instead met with bills like this that dissuade best teaching practices and place even more constraints on teachers in already tedious circumstances. After years of researching best practices in classrooms, let me reassure you that ignoring public policies and current events of the day won't make them magically go away. Such avoidance is the #1 way for teachers to keep their content culturally irrelevant to students. This kind of educational malpractice exacerbates achievement gaps as it renders students politically neutralized and habitually disengaged. In a state where more than half of public school students are children of color, we must become more inclusive and responsive to their needs. This bill seeks to do the opposite. All of my life I've been in Texas, and I've seen how legislation boils down to red or blue. But the reality of best practices in our schools requires more of us. The truth is, conversations about race, sex, class, and power dynamics can be uncomfortable. But our collective progress is on the other side of discomfort, not more legislation to limit educators during these trying times. Thank you for your time, and I'm open to any questions you may have.
Professor, thank you for your testimony. Senator Zaffirini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ma'am, in your written and oral testimony, you referred to even more constraints are placed on teachers by this legislation. Could you expand on that, please? What constraints?
Yes, ma'am. So when you look at the bill, I think what's problematic is it says that if a teacher decides that they are going to go ahead and discuss some of these public policies and current events, which we encourage practitioners to do, to create a safe space in classrooms where students can talk about things that they're seeing in the news, and the content and curriculum actually provides that they should understand opposing viewpoints, have these conversations and discussions. It seems to me that this bill is going to limit teachers. So specifically, if you look at language like there should be no political activism, or there should be no conversations around if a certain race or certain sex has, for instance, if you look at the one about meritocracy, it says, number 8, it says meritocracy are traits such as hard work, ethic, are racist or sexist, or were created by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race. It seems to me that when teachers see this kind of language spelled out with such detail, it's going to deter them from having conversations that would just quite naturally be happening around the issues that their students are seeing and bringing into the classroom to try to discuss. It seems like it's going to create a muzzle for teachers, and it's going to create something else that is an obstacle for them trying to create conversations that are meaningful in their classrooms around race, sex, power dynamics, and these types of things that seem taboo at this time for some people to get into in their classrooms.
Thank you. You also say that this legislation would, in effect, cause the ignoring public policies and current events. Could you explain how that would happen?
Yes. So what happens in classrooms sometimes, if you had any experience as an educator, is that sometimes you'll see top-down approaches to implementation in schools. That means that you might have a superintendent or a principal, some instructional leader that has become aware of new research in the field, and they want to introduce new approaches to instructional effectiveness to their teachers. This bill says, #1, the policy of any state agency, school district, charter school, or school administration is prohibited from compelling a teacher to discuss current events or widely debated or currently controversial issues. So to your point, with that question, this is going to say, if you are a principal at a school and you say, hey, we want to have this initiative where we're going to bring in these topics. We want to train our teachers on how to have these conversations in ways that are equitable, that do not spew their viewpoints onto the students. This bill says your principal cannot do that if you're a teacher that decides, no, I just don't want to do that. That's to your point. Number one is kind of what I'm seeing with that, to that effect.
And is it your testimony that if this legislation were to pass, discussions about race, sex, class, and power dynamics would be quashed?
For some teachers, it would. For some teachers, they're going to do what's best for their students, what's best practice, regardless of what you pass here today. But for some teachers, they're going to say, this is a lot. Let me take hands off and not even get into any of this stuff in a bucket.
Do you see any way in which this particular bill would advance civic education in Texas?
If it were amended, perhaps. I think the reason I testified on the bill and not against the bill was because I did feel like it would, in this time, be beneficial to teachers to have the kind of legislation that discuss further. If you look at number 2, for instance, it says teachers who choose to discuss these current events or widely debated controversial issues of public policy or social affairs are required to the best of their ability to strive to explore such issues from a diverse and contending perspectives without giving deference to their own perspective. I think that's something that could be beneficial that we could say teachers should do. But I think when you start to get into the details of, well, if you're talking about race or sex, this is what you can and cannot say, I think that should be up to the discretion of instructional leaders on their campuses to train their teachers accordingly. And as people are moving in that direction, I think there's no way to enforce this, and I don't know what the point of it is. As a former school administrator, that's what I would say.
In your opinion, would this bill impact the professional development or continuing education of social studies teachers?
For sure. One of these lines specifically says that you, in a teacher training, that you would be prohibited from being, teachers would be prohibited from being required to engage in training, orientation, or therapy. I don't know what that is. That presents any form of race or sex stereotyping or blame on the basis of race and sex. This is so general that it's like, what is it that you are and are not allowed to say? Because if truth be told, there are a lot of implications in our systems, in our institutions around race and sex that we just have to talk about. The fact that I'm sitting in this room looking around it is in and of itself that implication. So I just find it difficult for teachers to have more legislation coming, telling them what they can and cannot do as they are working to try to create classrooms in social studies and civics courses that are more just and inclusive, because that's what we need for students. And that's what the research tells us is best for their outcomes in terms of their achievement.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Powell.
Professor, when I went to the great all-knowing authority Wikipedia to look this up, to understand what critical race theory actually encompasses, the definition that I see here is critical race theory is an academic movement made up of civil rights scholars and activists in the United States who seek to critically examine the law as it intersects with issues of race and to challenge mainstream, quote, liberal approaches to racial justice. And then it goes on to talk about some unifying themes with regard to critical race theory, and the first being that white supremacy exists and maintains power through the law, and then second, that transforming the relationship between law and racial power and also achieving racial emancipation and anti-subordination more broadly are possible. Which just the definition of this scares me to death. Am I sort of reading that in the same vein as you think of critical race theory?
I'm glad you brought up critical race theory, because I think that's something that's in a lot of people's minds when we talk about these conversations around race and sex and power dynamics. I'm just going to keep defaulting those three. Critical race theory does not scare me to death. However, I have been a researcher and encountered the theory for years. I also do not build the practices that I teach to teachers necessarily on critical race theory. I look more so at if you ever get a chance to look into culturally responsive teaching practices or culturally relevant teaching. Essentially, what you see is critical race theory on its face says that we see within our institutions, baked into our institutions, privileges extended to white people and males specifically. And I think hearing that is jarring to some people when they say, well, that makes it sound like you're shifting blame and saying an individual is responsible for the inequities that we see in society, therefore I must be a bad person. This is all a lie. And so I think that's problematic, and that's probably what's catching you off guard when you read that. And so I don't necessarily promote critical race theory in my practice and what I do, because there are some scholars that get really far, I would say, off to one end of the spectrum, where they do start to inherently have some of these things that are in here. Again, why I'm testifying on the bill, because I don't think that it is necessarily beneficial to our students to learn that anybody is inherently bad because of their race or their sex. And so I think that's never going to be beneficial to students. I think it's more so important for us to be looking at institutions as a whole and systems as a whole and what our role as individuals are within those systems. And I think, again, I'm not here to advocate for critical race theory necessarily.
So I guess that begs the question, would you think that we need to build our civics programming for pre-K through 12 around that?
I would not.
Thank you.
Senators, any other questions for the professor? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you for your
being
time.
here. The chair calls Ed Heimlich.